Hi, everyone. Welcome to a time to connect in the middle of the week. What I'm thinking about today is grief, in particular, the ways in which grief can be sneaky and can kind of surprise us. I know that a lot of us associate, or most readily associate, grief with the loss of a loved one with death. And that's, of course, an obvious grief and a heavy grief that many of us bear. And yet there are other ways in which loss is real for us, in which grief can be sneaky because we don't always think about these things as loss. So perhaps I think about ways in which things that give us meaning, when those things shift, when those things change, that definitely is a loss to us. And so there is grief in those things, grief in saying goodbye to what was familiar, even as we may hope in what yet can be. And so I was reflecting a little bit this week that I think one of the best things, but perhaps one of the challenging things as well as people of faith, is that for us, we believe so readily in what God can yet do, in what God can yet create. We believe so deeply in the truth of resurrection life that sometimes it can make it hard for us to not so quickly move beyond the places of grief and loss in our lives. I think sometimes we want to move so quick to the hope of what God can yet do because grief is painful, it is difficult, it is uncomfortable for us. And so when we also believe and hope in what God can yet do, it may feel a little easier for us to quickly move into imagining what God can yet do. And so I have found myself in this season sometimes going back and forth very quickly between the tremendous hope of what God can yet do and then these moments of grief that surprise me, that sneak up on me. I'm thinking there's an imagery that I really like for grief that perhaps you've heard of, which is the idea of grief kind of being like waves in an ocean. That at a time of loss, the closer we are to that moment of loss, the pain of loss is very immediate, that it's a little like a storm, right? The waves come fast, they come furious, they knock us over, we don't have a chance to catch our breath. And then there are times when it can be a nice, clear, sunny, blue day, and the waves can be rolling easy and gentle, and yet still there can be moments even on those days when a wave will come out of nowhere and knock you down. As someone who loves the ocean, and some of it, what I love is that unpredictability of it, the mightiness of it. That's something I know very well. I know that even on the days of playfulness, of gentleness, of calm and joy, still a wave can get out of hand and knock you around. Grief can be sneaky like that. Grief can come up and surprise us, especially if we aren't thinking about it in terms of loss, those things that are losses to us. When we aren't thinking about the ways in which doing things different and change brings a loss with it. Doesn't mean that there doesn't hold promise and potential and the beauty of what God can create. It means that the paradox of our faith is that it holds us in the both and. It doesn't let us stay in one or the other. The challenge is not to move too quickly to one or away from the other. And so I'm thinking about grief, and I want to share a story with you in this time. And sometimes it's easier to see these things in others. And so this was true for me this week, is that I noticed this first in Sasha before I noticed it in myself. Our family, perhaps like many others, has been doing a lot of video calls and phone calls more than any other time in our lives. And so Sasha has been doing video chats with her grandparents, with her cousins, with her teachers and classmates. And a couple weeks ago, I began to notice something that was just so frustrating for me. Sasha would look forward to these times so much. She would love these times. And yet then in the middle of the video call, something would happen. She might shut down, or she might melt down or disengage. And it became so frustrating to me because I couldn't understand. She loved these times. She loves these people. She wanted to connect in this way. And yet, in the middle of it, something shifted. She would kind of shut down or melt down. And I just didn't understand it until I realized that sometimes sadness comes out sideways. Friends, sometimes grief interrupts us and surprises us. Sometimes my 4-year-old, almost 4-year-old, does the same thing. But I wanted to come and finish what I was thinking about, which is that sometimes sadness just comes out sideways. Sometimes our grief, we don't recognize it because it doesn't always come out like sadness. It can come out in so many different ways. Some ways that we know more personally than others. Sometimes it comes out as misbehaving. In small children, it comes out often as misbehaving. It might come out as lashing out. It might come out as sleepiness, or sometimes not being able to sleep. It might be anxiety. It might be wanting to help fix everything so that we don't have to think about our own places of pain and grief. And as I said, sometimes it's easier to see this and notice it and recognize it in others. And that's what happened for me this week, is that I noticed it in Sasha before I noticed it in myself, and was able to recognize ways in which grief has been coming up in my life. One of them for me was this Sunday when we shared Holy Communion. I said Sasha loves her video chats. They're meaningful, they are good for her, and she enjoys them, while at the same time they remind her of what is different, so she grieves. That's how Holy Communion was for me this week. It reminded me of the ways in which we are not physically together and how much I miss that, and I miss you, and I miss sharing space, being able to share the holy meal in that space. And so on Sunday morning, Holy Communion for me was something that was life-giving and good and meaningful, and it exacerbated the ways in which I am experiencing grief, things that are shifting, things that have been lost in this time. And so what I've tried to do in the last few days is give myself a little more space to experience grief and sadness, to notice how it comes up and tries to come out sideways in my life, and to be able to turn that over to God in prayer, to be able to journal it, to be able to spend some time in meditation and reflection, just to pay attention and notice it, give space for grief to show up. My friends, the last thing I would leave with you is, for me, one of the things I've reflected on is the story of Jesus when he is outside of Lazarus's tomb. Jesus weeps there. Even as Jesus will very soon work a miracle that brings him to new life, Jesus first weeps. And so I'm reminded of the ways in which we too can make space for grief to show up, even as we are still people of deep and tremendous hope, even as we wait for the resurrection life that God promises, even as our days can be both full of joy, new meaning, new ways of connecting, and also can be full of sadness, that the two can live side by side. And so, my friends, may you have space for grief, and may hope still ground us. May the peace of God enfold you in it all. Amen.